If everybody can take their seats, we will commence with our session on decarbonizing ports, building a net zero carbon roadmap. My name is Peter Terschwell. I lead the Journal of Commerce business within S&P Global Market Intelligence, and I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this panel. I posted a few comments on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, just sort of a little bit of a preface to this panel, essentially saying that, ports are being as proactive as they possibly can in participating in building a net zero carbon roadmap. You see ports very active on multiple fronts in trying to advance the transition to net zero within the overall maritime industry. And I think many ports can really be commended for the efforts that they are undertaking, which are costly and involve difficult decisions. However, ports are to a certain degree constrained by the overall uncertainty that exists in maritime decarbonization overall. So, big picture realities are that there is, vessel owners have built and are building zero carbon vessels, particularly in the container sector, who is the leader in this area. Methanol ships being built. I think I saw maybe the first ammonia ship being built. Obviously, fairly large uptake on LNG. But the reality is that the customers have shown themselves largely unwilling to fund the energy transition in maritime. The so-called zero carbon products that are offered by ocean carriers and freight forwarders to BCOs are seeing very, very little uptake. And that's not good or bad, it's just reality. The real reality being that the actual demand at scale for zero carbon transportation is only going to come, according to many people who observe this, once the huge cost differential between zero carbon fuels and traditional bunkers is bridged through some kind of fuel tax. And there is no fuel tax yet. The possibility of a fuel tax was stated in the revised greenhouse gas strategy of the IMO that was approved last year. And the IMO said at that point that in order to send the industry down a road towards net zero by or around 2050, there would be two main tools to do that. One would be essentially an economic measure or a carbon tax. The other would be a fuel standard of some kind, similar conceptually to the IMO 2020 low sulfur tax. But while a fuel standard is probably not nearly as controversial as a fuel tax, the idea of creating the consensus at the IMO in order to have a meaningful fuel tax that bridges the price gap and creates genuine demand, the industry is waiting on the edge of its seat for that to happen, because the IMO operates on the basis of consensus, and consensus is needed on a fuel tax, and a fuel tax is going to be very controversial at the IMO. So there's no clear indication yet that I've seen in terms of which way this is going, other than the fact that they haven't agreed to it yet. And there doesn't seem to be what I would consider, sort of overwhelming clarity, or nobody's celebrating, nobody's predicting anything. So, but the thing is that if you are an energy producer, so many zero carbon fuel projects have been announced, very few of those are actually being built. And the reason why that they're not being built is because the energy producers are not seeing the demand yet. And the only way that they're really going to see the demand is if there is some kind of pricing mechanism that bridges this gap in pricing. So the ports are left with a scenario where they are able to act on their own to a certain degree, to be good citizens, to be innovators in technology, to advance their own zero carbon agendas, which ports have done, many ports have done. But the big picture in terms of really getting this transition moving has not happened yet, and it will not happen until the international regulators put regulations in place that actually move it. And the EU is moving down this road. They're doing it, but they're not doing it in a way that is going to be a global catalyst for the industry to happen. So we're going to hear from a number of speakers who are going to offer a perspective on building a net zero carbon roadmap at seaports. So first, we're going to hear from Andy Tam, the Group VP of Energy Management for DP World. Andy, happy to have you with us. We're going to hear from Tomas Zielek. Tomas, I'm sure I've not pronounced your name correctly, the director, TPI director at World Crane Services. We're going to hear from Datuk Ruben Emir Galananam, executive chairman and group managing director of Westport Holdings. We're going to hear from Tan Wei Ming, the chief projects officer of the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization here in Singapore, which is doing amazing work in determining the technical feasibility of transitioning to zero carbon fuels in fuels like ammonia. And finally, we're going to hear from Taylor Wamberg, the regional maritime commercial markets manager for Lloyd's Register. Each of them is going to speak for about 12 minutes, and then get your questions ready because we'll be able to have a Q&A session afterwards. So Andy, we'll start with you.
So it's very fitting that Peter kind of set the scene in terms of what I'm talking about today, which is about regulation and incentive mechanisms, right? Peter mentioned that there is a little bit of uncertainty happening, right? And it's my personal belief that regulation is going to provide the certainty, the roadmap. And then we need to pair that with incentive mechanisms to really help drive the industry forward. So I'm going to kind of deep dive into a few of the regulations that are impacting us today in the shipping sector. But just as a preamble, right, we know that it's a pretty challenging regulatory landscape. You know, at DP World, we operate in over 70 countries around the world, and there's different regulations impacting us depending on the geography, right? Like collectively, we drive about 10% of global trade. And so, as you can imagine, like there's a lot that we have to do in order to stay relevant as well to our stakeholders, our customers, so on and so forth. You may or may not know, but DP World, we're an end-to-end service provider. So we not only operate ports, but we also operate in the logistics space and the maritime services space, and also the free zone and economic zone space. And so we kind of need to use decarbonization tools differently depending on the business that we're talking about, right? I'll focus specifically on a port sector today, but you know, what I'm trying to paint the picture is that it's relatively challenging, especially with so many different regulations impacting different sectors and different geographies. I also want to say that, you know, regulation is upon us, but regulation without subsidies is just a financial burden. I think we can all agree on that, right? But if we just have subsidies alone, that also doesn't work because it's going to be basically very slow to adapt. So what we need to have is we need to have both regulation and incentive mechanisms paired together well so that we can help move forward the industry for net zero. So let's deep dive a little bit, right, into the regulations that shape, you know, our shipping sector, right? Peter alluded to the IMO. As some of you will probably know, right, 20% reduction by 2030 is the IMO's directive, focusing on basically fuel efficiency and carbon intensity as those KPIs, as the main KPIs. But you can't really just set a regulation, right? And that's what the IMO has done. I think what it needs to be paired with is a subsidy for the new technologies that will drive down carbon emissions, for the technology that will improve fuel efficiency. And in the maritime sector, we know that, alternative fuels, that's the main barrier to entry, right? It's very costly presently. I believe traditional bunkering fuel right now is about, $600 per ton. When we're talking about e-methanol and e-ammonia, we're talking about $3,000 around dollars per ton. So we're close to, 5-6x. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge that financing gap? And that financing gap, as Peter alluded to, is about the demand signal. And that demand signal will not be there unless we bridge that financing gap for the infrastructure required to develop these e-methanol and e-ammonia facilities, right? There's a lot that goes into play. You need access to renewable energy, and you need access to all the, electrolyzers for the hydrogen, and then all the consequent chemical manufacturing processes, the infrastructure for that. All that requires heavy, heavy CapEx. And we really require the incentive mechanisms to help subsidize that CapEx, whether it be in the form of a tax break, or is it in the form of actual subsidization of CapEx, or is it, on the other side, perhaps a tax on traditional fossil fuels, right? Those are kind of the mechanisms that we can employ to help move forward this IMO regulation, to make it real. Moving on to the European ETS. This is the basically emissions trading system that we have coming in 2030 in Europe. That aim is to help reduce carbon emissions by about 20 to 30% for the sector. Now, how this works is a cap and trade system. And for those that are not too kind of interested in this subject, a cap and trade system is basically where the regulator sets a cap in terms of the emissions that are allowed within that sector. And then, a certain amount of emissions are allocated to different stakeholders within that sector. And over time, that cap is decreased. And so what happens is that the stakeholders within that sector, they have to trade these carbon emission credits. And as you can imagine, as scarcity increases in terms of the cap decreases, that means that they have to either trade carbon credits at an increasing price, or they have to green their own systems. Right? So that's what the European ETS is aiming to do. And the ETS is going to come into play by 2030, but starting in 2025, vessels that are pretty large have to start submitting emissions data. And, there are some severe penalties for vessel owners that don't do this, right? And so we're talking about, about 100 euros per ton in terms of a penalty starting 2030. Then we move on to the CBAM, right? The carbon border adjustment mechanisms, whereby basically in the EU, they're going to slap a tax on, carbon intensive products. So I'm talking about, cement, steel, hydrogen, any of that kind of stuff, right? And so the intention there is to start in 2026, and it accounts for the entire life cycle of the emissions for that product. So what I mean by that is basically, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And for those that don't know, scope 1 is related to the fuel used to make that product. Scope 2 is related to electricity used to make that product. And scope 3 is related to the emissions from the upstream and downstream value chain, right? And so essentially it takes into account the entire emissions value chain and slap a tax on that. Now, the European CBAM is very interesting because it's basically a regulation on a regulation if you pair it with the EU ETS that I just talked about, right? So it's great that we have so much regulation to give more certainty in terms of what the roadmap's supposed to be like, but really to make us as stakeholders move forward, we need some kind of benefit as well, right? And then lastly, in terms of the CSRD, this is the Corporate Standard for Reporting Directive that many companies have to start doing. Essentially, it applies to companies that have larger than 250 people, larger than 400 million euros in revenue, or 20 million in assets. And again, this has to be both a scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. And this is to help, make sure that basically your investors, your customers, stakeholders, regulators, all that understand what your company is doing in terms of, emissions, climate, corporate sustainability, corporate social responsibility, so on and so forth. But it comes with a challenge as well, right? Great that we have to do this new reporting standard. It increases transparency. But the challenge is that you have to find the right human resources within your organization to really be able to report on this, because it's not simple to report on, right? It's pretty in-depth. And so hiring the right people is what's required for this. Okay, so let's talk about what does the future enablement look like, okay? So as I mentioned, we really want to integrate regulation and subsidies together. Now, in a perfect world, this is what I see the future as, okay? In terms of, and how it impacts the port industry too. So first of all, shore power, we know that it's coming. We know that it's required to reach net zero. But what does that really mean, right? Shore power is incredibly expensive. And so even with just regulation, that's not gonna work. So ideally, in the future, we have subsidies that help subsidize the CapEx required for shore power. And I put an example there in terms of what has happened historically. And so a good example here is in China, in I think the early 2010, 2013, that kind of area, they were able to successfully reduce the emissions from their industrial sector by about 20%. And they did this by doing two things. They pulled two levers. They basically eliminated a fossil fuel subsidy, okay? But in addition to that, they implemented a cap and trade system for the industrial sector, right? So basically, they had two levers there to pull. And through that, they were able to reduce the industrial sector emissions by about 20%. Moving on to green equipment. As we know, as port operators, we need to electrify our equipment. But electrifying our equipment is also quite expensive, right? We have seen some tremendous progress in terms of reduction of CapEx for green equipment. But at the same time, in the future, what I would love to see is, tax incentives if we do buy green, right? We're not asking to subsidize directly our CapEx, because we know that green equipment, for example, has a longer depreciation life that we can, amortize. But let's focus on the tax end. Are we able to get some tax subsidies there? And I think a great example of this is in the US in the early 2000s, actually, over a decade. Basically, the US government implemented stricter emissions for OEMs making automobiles. At the same time, they paired it with a tax incentive for customers in terms of buying hybrids. And so through that, they were able to actually, over that decade, see about 8% decrease in their emissions. And lastly, new fuels and technology, right? We can't move the sector without new technology and grants, in my opinion. But what this means is that, hey, okay, we talked about subsidies. We talked about tax credits. We talked about, removing subsidies for fossil fuel alternatives. But what we haven't talked about is financing, right? Are we able to leverage some of these programs for favorable financing for, basically a better hurdle rate on your capital projects? So what I see in the future is that we have favorable financing for those heavy CapEx investments designed to create e-methanol, e-ammonia, that kind of stuff, right? Because, as Peter alluded to earlier, the demand isn't there yet. And the reason the demand isn't there because there's not favorable financing, it's too expensive, yada, 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 right? Those are all the things that we need to bridge with regulation and incentive mechanisms. So with a minute left, I just have a couple parting thoughts. So I've been hammering regulation and incentives, right? But what we need to do collectively as an industry, all our stakeholders, I believe we need to lobby for this, right? It's one thing to accept regulation, but it's another thing to actively ask our stakeholders, ask our regulators, hey, what are the good programs that you can do to help us move forward? And I mean, there's some really good examples, right? And I believe here in Singapore, they also have some green financing mechanisms for heavy infrastructure that stakeholders can leverage. Other examples, for example, in Canada, there's a Green Shipping Corridor Transport Fund, which subsidizes up to 50% of CapEx. That paired with an investment tax credit that the federal government in Canada is also basically targeting both the CapEx side and the OpEx side. Lastly, Inflation Reduction Act in the US, we've seen tremendous stuff happening in the past couple years in terms of companies leveraging the Inflation Reduction Act to move forward green for technologies such as, small nuclear reactors, for example, hydrogen, so on and so forth. I think that we also need to utilize energy management technologies. What we haven't done in the sector is we're tackling the top line, so to speak, right? It's like, okay, so we have, X amount of kilowatt hours, X amount of emissions. We need to try to make that green. But what we're not trying to do is we're not trying to reduce our consumption, and leveraging energy management techniques, such as leveraging smart grids, microgrids, doing power quality monitoring, doing demand response. Those are things that have been in the utility sector for decades that we are not really leveraging within the port sector presently. And lastly, we can't do this alone. Collaboration is essential to tackle all this kind of stuff. So I, encourage all stakeholders to form alliances, partnerships, really to help send a strong demand signal to both OEMs, to regulators, to other stakeholders to drive forward net zero. So that concludes my presentation today on regulation and incentive mechanisms. I hope that you learned something, and I also encourage you to ask me some questions afterwards if you. Thank you very much.
Andy, thank you very much. I think that you heard from what Andy was saying, the fact that port operators, and obviously DP World is now much more than a port operator operating in the end-to-end space, but as much as they are doing and as proactive as they are being, they need help, and they can't do it alone. And it just goes to show that the energy transition in the maritime space overall is going to require the support of individual governments through incentives. It's going to involve the support of governments possibly supporting financing, and it's also going to involve the support of international regulation. This is a transition that the industry is not going to be able to completely fund on its own, and to the extent that other sources of support are not forthcoming, this is going to be a slower transition with whatever consequences that might bring. So thank you, Andy. We'll next hear from Thomas Ziolek, the Director of World Crane Services. Thomas, give you the floor.
Thank you, Peter. I'm first time in Singapore, and one of the main things that it comes to my mind is efficiency. And that's tying up a little bit what Andy mentioned, that is a little bit missed in the decarbonization part to link efficiency and optimization. And that's one of the things that we would like to help the terminals. My name is Thomas. I'm an engineer, and in World Crane Service, we are a bunch of engineers who are passionate about cranes, and we like to solve problems. And that's why we are providing various solutions for the terminal operators. Briefly, our histories, we were founded in 2002. And I will tell you a little bit of a story of WCS, and then how our ideas of optimization and various services that we do tied up into decarbonization. So, as mentioned, we were established in 2002, started as third-party inspection only, and that further we developed into various services and revenue streams. Our parent company is a leading terminal operator, and we have received guidance and support from our parent company, and which help us to develop various services that help decarbonizing the ports as well. So we do various projects in terms of refurbishment of the equipment, from old diesel engines into newer ones, electrical drive systems, mechanical structural upgrades, and inspections, reliability checks. So there's one part of the business. The other one is manufactured products. You may know our lashing cages, and recently we have introduced reefer racks, which are quite interesting product. We develop it worldwide. We sell it worldwide into US market, Europe market, and it's all manufactured in Dubai. On top of that, we bind it up together with consultancy services. which is most relevant for this discussion to start with. We look at operations on the terminals and how we can help the terminals to reduce their carbon footprint and to increase the efficiency of their equipment. Looking at these initiatives, we divided it in 4 categories for purpose of this presentation. Generally, first item, we should electrify whatever is possible, if possible. If the grid allows, everything should be run electric, and that's relatively easy and simple to understand. Other part of the feasibility studies is starting up to energy management system and removing all the possible waste in terms of terminal power management system, including batteries and allowing, reducing the waste. The third part would be renewable energy. We'll have a trials of hydrogen RTGs next year to see how we can work up with this project and how viable it is for commercial purpose. Lastly, port automation. This is something also we advise towards our customers, how to optimize utilization of the equipment and how collection of the data via 5G can support us into optimizing how we work. On the other hand, every terminal is unique. Every terminal has its specific location, type of equipment, labor, the vessels that they handle, and we would like to tailor our solutions towards the customer. So there are, let's say, on the horizontal axis, we have various stages of, let's say, electrification, starting from basically terminal driven fully on diesel, with mobile harbor cranes, for example, and RTGs. What we can do there is hybrid equipment, container handling equipment, RTGs, also optimizing operations, which eventually results in reducing carbon footprint. Further on we go, for example, STS cranes running with diesel RTGs. Electrification of the yard is relatively common sense these days. Obviously, it needs to make financial sense, but the technology is there. So smart management system of the power consumption and distribution is also should be looked at this level. And further on, if we go to fully electric terminals, there is always possibility to reduce waste, looking at holistically at what the terminal does from their operations and the power systems. Lastly, we aim for terminal of the future, which we don't yet know how it will look like. We would hope it would be, would provide power rather than use it, but that's something that needs to be developed, and potentially some of you guys will help on it. So combining all those actions into plan, we would look at the terminal, their needs and operation, and then provide various solutions, which we can execute ourselves or via our partners. We work with various suppliers, whether this is electrical suppliers or mechanical units, and we are not tied up to a specific brand. Therefore, we would always tailor the solution towards what the customer really needs. And looking at their equipment, their solutions, maintenance team, to make it most efficient from cost perspective as well. So therefore we have conversion from RTGs to ERTGs, hybrid solutions, hydrogen application, but also we did work with terminal in Jebel Ali on electrification of the terminal tractors, or conversion of the diesel units into ETTs. This is a challenging project. It does have potential, and currently with battery prices going down, it makes more financial sense, and that needs to be worked out to be fully commercialized. But it is possible, something that 10 years ago nobody would think about. On the other hand, we made a survey with our customers in terms of the obstacles for electrification. And mainly, as the guys were saying, it is financial infrastructure obstacles that they see, access to green energy. So that's the majority of concerns. So important item here is that it's not a concern about technology. Technology is there, we can apply it. It's just a matter of cost. That means it's just a matter of time that it will be applied. In summary, the main goal for us is first to provide the feasibility studies for the terminals and look holistically at what the terminal does, how they execute their operations, what are the cargo they are handling, and then provide them unique solutions to meet their roadmap to decarbonization. That also includes support on granting some of the funds, for example, from European Union on countries that would support green energy transition, and that looking into support on getting sort of tax advantages or grants that would finance this transition. So that we all package in the report, in the feasibility studies, and we propose solutions to our customers. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. During the Q&A, Thomas, I'm going to want to get into this a little bit further, but a couple things that you said I think stood out as being fairly important. One of them being that it's often not a question of technology. That technology is there, it's ready in many cases, but it's really just a question of cost and feasibility. So we hear this actually more broadly in the maritime industry about decarbonization, because when it comes to, say, engines for ships to run on zero carbon fuels, we hear that those engines are ready, that the engine manufacturers are ready. They have the technology in many cases. But it's just, again, a question of cost and the ability for those fuels to be funded. And so maybe it's an overly generalized statement to make that technology is running ahead of feasibility in many cases in this broader subject of maritime decarbonization. But I think that you can, at least as it relates to a lot of the activities within the industry that create emissions today, that is probably to a certain degree the case. So it really then does come down to the policy questions of incentives, regulations, and that as soon as regulations are aligned and financing is aligned, consensus is aligned, that you could see a massive boost forward because the technology is sitting there being ready. So, but you can challenge me on that one, feel free. Next, we'll hear from Datuk Ruben Amir Ganalingam, the Chairman and Group Managing Director of Westport Holdings. So, Datuk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. You got my name right the second time, so thank you for that. It's not an easy name, to be fair. It's Sri Lankan, so it's not easy to pronounce. So thank you for having me here at this conference, and thank you, Peter, for moderating us. And I'm happy to join this illustrious panel to discuss this very important topic for all of us. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on just one port. I'm not going to talk about decarbonizing ports. We're going to talk decarbonizing just the one port because we only have one location globally, and that's where our focus today is. So I always like to start with this slide because this slide shows 7 pictures of our 7 sustainability reports that we've started to publish since 2017. And although we have all these awards, I think the most crucial part for any port who wants to decarbonize, you have to start by having a sustainability report. That is the fundamental building block which you need to start your journey. If you don't have a sustainability report, you won't know where you are, and therefore you can't measure what you need to do, and therefore you can't plan where you need to go. So this is where I always like to start off with regards to anyone who wants to take on this journey of trying to decarbonize. You need to start with a sustainability report, and our achievements to date have been because we've refined this report year by year, trying to get better and better every year to go greener and more efficient, and also higher governance as well. So this is just some of our our overall sustainability framework. Obviously here we're focusing more on the E side. But I also put in the S and the G, in case anybody was interested in those. So with regards to the environment side, our critical thing that we're trying to do, like everybody else, is to reduce our emissions, right? So that is, I think, the number one goal for everyone, But one of the key things that we found over the years is that we want to make sure that this change is done sustainably, and also the change is done in a just manner. Right? And therefore, when it also helps us improve productivity and efficiency, that really helps. But the ROI, unfortunately for me, is the most important part of this journey. And I'll come back to this because it's very crucial for us to understand why we're doing this change and how we're going to do this change, right? So for me, I know it pains a lot of people who discuss these things with me when I focus on ROI, but this seems to be three very dirty words to a lot of vendors out there. But this is where it has to go, in my opinion. And the reason for this, in my opinion, is because at the end of the day, why are we doing all this change? Why are companies being asked to make these changes? It's not because of companies. And actually, who's causing most of these emissions? It's consumers. It's actually everybody in this room. And the key problem here is that as much as all of us would like to have a greener planet, a study shows that approximately only 20% are actually willing to pay for it. And of that 20%, very few are willing to pay a lot for it. And as a result, if it doesn't come with ROI, then it can't be solved, actually. And actually, so the key thing for me is when we look in this hall, I can tell you 90% of this hall won't pay for it. And me included potentially as well, right? So how much would I be willing to pay? So this is where, if you don't have an ROI backing your sustainability plan, it's not going to work, especially in our industry, especially in the container shipping line industry, where you have, everyone is basically a low-cost carrier. I know some shipping lines claim that they prefer, they prefer service over price, but I can tell you all shippers care about price. They don't care about service. They don't care about on time. They pretend to care that the delivery comes on time, but actually price is the most important part. And because our customers deal with price as a key factor, it's because their customers deal with price as a key factor. I have one shipping line tell me very clearly, that none of his customers are willing to pay more, and it's because none of their customers are willing to pay more. But he said for every one of those customers not willing to pay more, the bigger issue is there's 1,000 times more customers who can't afford to pay more. So first, the issue is a lot of us don't want to pay, but I think there's thousands more of us who can't afford to pay. And this is why I think ROI has to be one of the key driving forces when it comes to sustainability, unfortunately. The other thing I would like to highlight here is, and I'll come back to this again, is anti-greenwashing. So it's sometimes very funny when people say that, they're going green on certain things, but the truth of the matter is they're not. I'll come back to this at the end. With regards to scope 1, these are some of the things that we've done, obviously, to try and reduce the emissions that we have on those equipment, basically to slightly electrify them or to change the source of the energy. And these are the things that we've done so far. Exploring, although we have 2 automated electric trucks right now from a company named Westwell, and actually those trucks are running very, very fine. The reason why I'm putting on the exploring side is because it's not actually making us go green. I know, Thomas, you mentioned that everything should be electrified. I think the problem there is that in Malaysia, the grid is so dirty that actually electrification means higher emissions. So on the Westwell trucks that we have, on the 2 Westwell trucks we have, they actually produce higher emissions, 50% higher emissions than the diesel trucks we have. And strangely, because the grid is greening so slow, the change from Euro 7 to Euro 20 to Euro whatever on the diesel side means the diesel is actually getting cleaner when it comes to emissions at the end of the day. So not always is electrification the answer, but I do agree with regards to like RTGs, we're going to electrify those RTGs, right? Because those make sense. So I think, again, you need to do it where it makes sense, and you need to make sure that you focus on what we're actually trying to do, which is actually save the planet, right? So, and instead of just trying to pretend you're going green. So these are some of the things we're doing on scope 1. With regards to scope 2, we have now implemented a solar plant. We're going to invest into another solar plant for another 7 megawatts. Of course, LED lighting, air conditioning, digital power meters, all these are normal things that everybody else is doing. And we're also exploring, obviously, wind energy, which is very hard in the Straits of Malacca, wave and tidal, and also some hydrogen. So these are the kind of things we're exploring on to try and get towards greener for scope 2. Scope 3 is something that we're not really doing, to be honest. We're taking an approach of, let's see where the market goes. There are lots of companies investing in all kinds of vessels, but one of the key things about these vessels I see all the time is that it's dual fuel. So it may be ammonia, it may be methanol, it may be whatever else, but it's always dual fuel. And none of them seem to be committing, but I think once they do, it'd be easy for us to also commit then, because if it comes to regulations, it's definitely slightly easier, because then someone has to pay for it for sure. But the key thing here is that I need to understand how it's going to affect the consumer at the end of the day, because they're the ones who actually need to pay for it, because they're the actual ones causing the pollution. So these are some of the other things we do with regards to circular economy. Reducing paper, the waste as well, and rainwater. Planting trees is something that we do quite a lot of. We're going to be planting about 100 hectares worth of trees over the next 20 years. And of course, ensuring that, all these things are managed as best we can, again, to reduce as well some of the wastage and emissions that we do cause. So I said I'd come back to this. One of the key things here that we've started to have right now is we have an anti-greenwashing policy, right? So basically what this means is that we can't say we're going green unless it's really taking us to go green. So that's why, if you saw the slide earlier, it's actually on the right side of the slide, because we haven't implemented it, because although we have EV trucks, they're not actually making us go green. So they can't be put on the left side of the chart because of this anti-greenwashing policy. Why this is important, I feel, is because there's so many companies right now claiming a lot of nonsense about going green when they're actually not going green at all. That's one. Two, it also helps us deal with vendors, because we say if you can't pass our anti-greenwashing policy, then we can't deal with you either. So this actually helps us filter out the companies which are actually really making us go green versus the ones who claim to make us go green. And I think this is also very, very crucial when it comes to how we want to take these things going forward. I think we're the first company definitely in Malaysia to actually have this policy, but something we're very proud of it, but it also helps us from a practical perspective to understand what we need to do. But as I said, my closing thoughts on this topic is that why are we all trying to go sustainable, right? So I think, in my opinion, the key danger towards climate change, right, is not so much the thunderstorms and the additional hurricanes and all of those minor climate change issues that will happen. I think over the next 50 years, those will kill about 100 million people, right? And for me, that's negligible. The bigger danger for me is when the sea level rises. Not because my business will literally be underwater, which also will be the case, but because I think that will actually kill 7 billion people, right? And I think that's the one we have to try and prevent. The issue here is that even if we go to net zero carbon next year, we're not going to solve it just like that. And that's why I like the idea just now, of a carbon tax. But what I don't like from the EU, for example, is they say they want a CBAM for imported goods, to have a carbon tax on imported goods, but they don't actually really have a strong carbon tax on their own goods produced within the EU itself, right? And every year we have a COP at some country, and they never really talk about these things. So I'm really not sure whether people really want to go green, right? And I'm not really sure whether they really want to solve the sea level rise, which is actually the biggest issue, which will kill 7 billion people. So sometimes from a cynical perspective, I actually think it's actually easier to figure out how to be part of the 1 billion people who survive. Because the good news about climate change is that it's not an extinction level event. 1 billion people will survive. And maybe it's actually cheaper and easier to figure out how to be part of that 1 billion people as opposed to trying to solve the whole thing. Because unless all of us, I think the key word just now was mentioned by Andy, which is collaborate. I think unless all of us collaborate and commit to wanting to have change and wanting to pay for change and wanting to make sure that it's affordable change, I think that's where, that's how we're going to do it. And I think with regards to the technology question that Peter, you brought up just now, I think you mentioned that technology is readily available. The problem is I think technology also makes it cheaper. So I think the technology to make it cheaper is not available yet. And if you can have the technology to make it cheaper, then the ROI comes to fruition. So, whilst companies might claim the technology is here, I think the technology is here when the solution is affordable. And when everybody can afford it, that's when it's going to be implemented by everyone. And I think that's how we're going to try to solve climate change eventually. Thank you.
Datuk, thank you very, very much. I mean, you don't hear a presentation like that every day. So, and I do mean that, because there is a fairly wide spectrum of genuine commitment to decarbonization. And as you yourself alluded to, there is a lot of pretending, a lot of posturing, a lot of PR and marketing associated with decarbonization. But I can certainly tell from everything you said that this is a subject that you and Westports are taking very seriously. You can see it in everything you said, and that your commitment is absolute, and we need more people like you, frankly. So we'll move on now to Tan Wei Ming, the Chief Projects Officer of the Singapore-based Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization. Wei Ming?
My part of the presentation will focus on the maritime industry, but specifically on the ships, right? The global fleet contributed about 3% of global GHG, and probably is about the size of what Germany will give out in a year. And my focus primarily is on the water side and how the ship, in their choice of fuel and the decarbonization technology, will affect the ports that they call. In total, I have 14 slides, but I only have 12 minutes, so I may have to go a little bit faster. If you are interested in any of the slides, please do take a picture and we can discuss after the presentation. A very brief update on what we are doing. We are from this Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization set up by the partners that you see there, right? And we are very thankful for these partners because they both funded us as well as provided a lot of their times and expertise to share with us in terms of what we wanted to do, right? Our mission is to help the maritime industry eliminate GHG emission by shaping standards, deploying solutions, financing projects, and fostering collaboration across sectors. So you see on the screen now are the projects that we are looking at, specifically 4 separate tracks, right? So for today, I basically will only cover that of ammonia as a marine fuel. The other 3 tracks are also very interesting, but for interest of time, I will not be covering them. Okay, what you see now on the screen, right, is a comparison of what we have gathered so far from the industry, right? In particular, also reports coming through from DNV, LR, Maersk, McKinney Moller Center, and from ourselves, right? So this information that you see on the screen, right, is a simplified comparison of what traditional fuel will be like versus the new alternative fuel. On the screen, you see things like biofuel, and also the other more attractive ones like hydrogen, and obviously methanol and ammonia. Each of them have their own unique characteristic, right? The green one obviously are favorable, yellow maybe a little bit taxing. The red one are those that have real serious challenges. And of the fuel that we see, right, one of the key concerns that when we look at the industry is this idea of volumetric energy density. Right? If you look at the column showing volumetric energy density in comparison to the fossil fuel, right? Almost all the alternative fuels are lower. This particular slide is a project that we have done, right? We do a survey and there are total 128 respondents. Now, each of them give us their views as well as what they intend to do from a strategic perspective. And we are quite happy to note that for the front runners, right, about 30 of them, by 2029, they are quite sure that they will adopt ammonia in one way or another. Now, to us, this is a very positive news. Notwithstanding that, yes, there are a lot of concern globally that whether will all the shipping lines put their money where their mouth is, right? Because like the earlier presenter also mentioned, there's a lot of time, a lot of talks are being given with regards to being green, but whether you are going to do it or not. This is a very brief sketch showing the major shipping route. Now, the key concern here we see is that because of the lower energy density of the future fuel, the new fuel, right? So one of the key impact would be the modification to the vessel, because they would need to have a bigger bunker tank, for example. Alternatively, and most likely that would be the case, is that they will have more stops for bunkering. Now, when you have more stops for bunkering, it will affect specifically ports, right? Because in a location, for some of the ports, right, it may be comfortable to be just, say, for example, a bulk port or container port. But if your volume is big enough, right, and when the vessel call at your port with unique requirement for future fuel, there may be a need that in the overall localized ecosystem port infrastructure development point of view, there may be a need to also cater for future fuel storage. And this is quite important and also at the same time highly costly, right? And at the moment, my view is that a lot of the time, a lot of talks are in the air, but no action taken, is because when you invest heavily into the likes of storage for ammonia, for example, the typical tank storage infrastructure cost for typical traditional bunker fuel is quite different, right? We did our own estimate before, and it's about 1.5 to 2 times with a much smaller holding capacity. Okay, what you see on the screen now is actually the way we interpret if ammonia is going to be a maritime fuel, how it will go. Unlike the traditional one, whereby the vessel will go into a specific bunkering port, for example, in Singapore, right? You have the service of the bunker vessel. But for ammonia, especially during the transition stage, and we see that in the current adoption of future fuel, we are expecting to see easily close to 30 years of transition for various reasons. Number one, stability of the source of the fuel. Number two, technology. Number three, the type of propulsion system. All these will affect the choice that the shipping line will have to make with regards to whether do they adopt methanol, ammonia, or biofuel, for example, right? So the way we visualize if ammonia is going to be a maritime fuel is that near-term transitional stage. Unlikely any of the bunkering ports is prepared to invest heavily into ammonia land-based storage facilities because of the really high cost, right? And the concern that it could become a stranded asset should the decision taken is that globally a new fuel is being discovered. And therefore, the current infrastructure will have to be discarded. So the way we see it is that potentially the approach will be having a larger VLGC, for example, acting as a floating storage with smaller ABV, the ammonia bunkering vessel, taking cargo from the VLGC and then to bunker to the AFV, as in the ammonia fueled vessel. Okay. So how we see the drive, right? I think the earlier speaker have also pointed to the fact that be it by regulation, when you clamp it tight enough, definitely you will be able to drive the change. At the same time, when we look at ammonia, for example, there are other advantages as well, right? Advantages in the sense that because of the geography, for example, and also the fact that in terms of a specific route that they are doing, ammonia can be used as one of the potential future fuel. I'm running really short of time, so I'm going to speed through the last few slides, but this few slides will be more covering into the technical aspect of things. For example, in this slide, what you are seeing is that we believe that if there could be a progressive change, the ammonia carrier themselves at the moment, right, because of carrying ammonia for agricultural use, potentially if they convert it into ammonia propulsion, the cargo can be used as a fuel. So they are potentially the early adopter of this new fuel. The second one are the bulk carriers, right? In next few slides, I will show you why we think that it is a good opportunity for them to adopt this new fuel because of geography. These are the 5 factors when we are doing the trial by ourselves to determine whether a particular port have the infrastructure and the intention to go about making the change, right? So these are the 5 factors that we use in our project. Okay, this particular one is showing the link, right? The iron ore route. One of the largest bulk cargo movement in the world is iron ore, right? Primarily from Australia, Western Australia, Pilbara region, right? World largest iron ore export terminal, and primarily their endpoint is only in one country, China, right? The likes of ports in Zhoushan, Qingdao, okay? And this one have a lot of vessel called very, very big bulkers, high demand for bunker, right? For example, projected bunker volumes up to 1 million tons by 2035. This is one of the routes we believe can do the conversion. This is what we have done in Pilbara, Australia, doing the trial. We couldn't get the actual ammonia fueled vessel, right? So we actually simulated using a carrier, right? The gas carrier. These 2 vessels effectively have specialist crew on board, fully aware of the risk of handling ammonia, right? We simulated a break bulk using these 2 ammonia carrier and also simulated bunkering, right? Transferring 4,000 cube one way and then transferring 4,000 cube back, right? The purpose is to demonstrate whether can it be done, what are the safety concerns, and what are the learning, right? The end in mind is to share with everybody who are keen to do the actual transfer. These are the learning points, and in particular, what we like is that as much as we identify all these key challenges, right, they can be solved, right? Most importantly is prepare to put the money where the mouth is. This slide shows the approach that we are taking in order to close the gap, right? At the moment, we are planning up to the one in green, and potentially we try to close as much as possible so that in the longer term, at steady state, we are able to safely handle ammonia, despite the fact that the key concern is toxicity. And this is my last slide. The center itself is a non-profit organization. You can use the QR code, right? You can download the reports free of charge, right? So what we are going to publish by the first quarter of next year is the experiment that we try in Pilbara, right? The learnings are there, and feel free to give us any comment that you like. My last comment with regards to this particular panel discussion is that I think going forward, right, especially in terms of port infrastructure investment, there's the need to take into consideration the type of technology that the vessel will adopt for decarbonization and also the fuel. because there would definitely be times, especially the investment period is long, like 15 to 30 years, there would definitely be certain juncture in time the port will be forced to handle this type of new cargo and new technology. If the macro planning, because I have some background in terms of port planning, if the macro planning doesn't take into consideration the needs to install, for example, ammonia storage facilities, right? Or for that matter, if you talk about using liquefied CO2 capture and so on, where to download them and things like that, right? So all this will affect the economic value of the port. And that if the situation gets worse, technically speaking, people will move away from that particular location. Right. Thank you very much for your patience.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Wei Ming. I think, a couple of important points came out in what Wei Ming was saying. First of all, there's a view that ammonia as a marine fuel has huge potential because of cost and availability. If the safety and technology challenges can be overcome. I think this is a core principle of the Global Center of Maritime Decarbonization, just watching them, what they're publishing, what they're saying, what they're doing research on. They have a view of ammonia as a fuel that is somewhat scary because of how toxic it is, but what the potential of ammonia could be if it could be handled safely. And you see a lot of work being a lot of work being done by the center for the purpose of trying to overcome the safety concerns and to get an infrastructure in place within the industry to be able to facilitate the handling of ammonia. So that's great, and that's important work that's being done by the center. Finally, we're going to hear from Taylor Wamberg, the Regional Maritime Commercial Markets Manager for Lloyd's Register. Taylor.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to TOC for the invitation to speak. My name is Taylor Wamberg. I'm the Maritime Commercial Markets Manager at Lloyd's Register, and my role is to take knowledge that we have from our traditional business as a class society and as a maritime advisor to ship owners and shipyards, and look at how we can share that with a wider stakeholder group, charters, traders, banks, insurers, and ports, in an advisory standpoint, and make sure that we are facilitating the transition and providing advice to that stakeholder group. Lloyd's Register is traditionally a maritime classification society, but we also have a large advisory part of our business as well, where we take the information and knowledge that we've gained over the 270 years of our existence and use that to help the industry. And a big part of what we've been doing more recently has been around the energy transition. And probably one other thing to share is that our 100% shareholder is the Lloyd's Register Foundation. So all of our profits go up into that in order to finance or provide funding for projects to work towards a safer world. So when we start to look at the opportunities and challenges in developing port infrastructure for a zero emissions shipping economy, I think we've covered a lot of the opportunities. We've also heard a lot about the challenges, but one thing that keeps coming up is regulation. And it would be remiss as a class society if we didn't talk about that at the beginning. So there's a whole host of regulation that's being thrown at the shipping industry to really push the change that we want to see and meet the goals that we've set for 2030 and 2050. And this is good because it makes people think about it. We've got regulation that affects the design of vessels to make sure vessels are efficient. We've got regulation to make sure they are operated efficiently. And as we've heard before, there's a whole host of future regulation that's coming with the midterm and long-term measures from the IMO that look to set a technical fuel standard and then also look to put some kind of commercial measure around either a carbon tax or some other fee-based mechanism, which I'll come to shortly. But we also have other geographic, regulations coming up in different jurisdictions. The EU being the best example, and credit to them, they're a bit further ahead from the IMO. EU ETS, this is the first year where ship owners are having to pay for the carbon emissions that they make when they're trading into and out of the EU. And next year, we'll see the equivalent of the EU fuel standard come into place, where it will become progressively more expensive to use traditional fuels in comparison to new fuels. The risk with this is that we end up, as people lose patience with the IMO, or if the IMO can't move quick enough, that we get a tiered market, a fragmented market, where we have ship owners, ship designers designing vessels for specific regulatory regimes, and we lose that flexibility between different jurisdictions, which we enjoy now because of the global nature of the IMO's regulation. But it also doesn't really help us meet our goal of decarbonising the maritime industry. So looking further ahead, the future's clearer, but still not clear. We know that the IMO is working on what their future measures will be, and we know that there'll be these two technical and a sort of a commercial measure, a carbon tax, but we don't really know what they are. And I think that adds a lot of uncertainty when we're looking ahead to trying to plan and anticipate what the maritime industry is going to do. And in turn, that makes it very challenging for ports and terminals to start to work and accommodate towards meeting those goals and helping the shipping industry meet those goals. And it's a little bit of a wait and see. But what I think is clear, and maybe disappoints some people in the room, is I don't think we'll see the really high tariffs that we would need to make that parity between traditional fuel and zero emission fuels. So we'll need to find other ways to bridge that gap. So what options are there to shipping, and how do ports work into them? Well, I see it as 4 pillars. We have future or alternate fuels, which we've discussed. We have energy saving devices, which I think have less of an impact on ports, particularly in the container segment, because I can't see things like wind assisted technology really playing too much of a role in containerization, which would get in the way of container cranes, things like that. We have optimization, so using what we already have in a much better and more efficient manner. So that could be slowing down, but it's also about planning and working with ports. I think it's really worth calling that out, because if we can reduce the amount of energy that we need on a yearly basis to do the shipping work that we do today, that paves the way a little bit, makes it a little bit easier for using more expensive fuels that are less energy dense. And then, of course, we've got the electrical side of things as well. So whether that's shore power, electric tugs, and things like that. And shipping and ports, there's a symbiotic relationship. They don't work without the other. But I think ports really become that public interface of the maritime industry. So some of the opportunities beyond being a bunker provider is that there's the potential to improve local emissions. In the container segment, the ports tend to be a little bit closer to communities and things like that. So there's other opportunities there beyond just being a bunker supplier. If you have fuel within your port, there's potential other uses for that, or if you can work with your government, which I believe is happening in some areas where actually if you're providing ammonia as a shipping fuel, actually the larger demand for that would come from the power generation sector. But of course, there's other things to think about. As a port, you could play a role, you could just facilitate vessels that are coming to your port with alternative fuels. You don't necessarily need to be a bunker supplier. Even to do that, there's different safety concerns, which we've heard earlier, around future fuels. Ammonia being the one that gets the most attention, but also methanol requires different firefighting procedures and things like that as well. You can think about ways that you could plan and optimize operations and things like that as well, along with the safety considerations. So in the shipping market, we are seeing an uptick in the adoption of alternate fuels. And so this kind of shows that we're seeing a steady uptick, but there's still some uncertainty. And I think I'm going to come to that shortly. It's still a nascent technology. And the first hurdle, the first challenge is that we need to be very cautious of the difference between vessels that are said to be future fuel ready and those that are future fuel capable. And this will help ports in planning ahead as well. So there's I think if we go back to the previous slide, if it'll let me, in the order book, so the vessels that are being ordered, nearly 50% of the vessels are future fuel ready or capable when they're ordered. But we need to pay attention to that ready or capable, because there's different levels of readiness. Readiness could be providing space in the engine room for for alternate fuel equipment to be added. Readiness could be that you've got pipe work there. Readiness could be that you've got space for fuel tanks, or it could be something much simpler than that, which means there's a much larger capital investment. So it has the potential to give a false indication of where the industry is going. And I think it's worth calling out that as a hurdle. The other thing is where the fuel comes from. So there are a whole host of different colors. And actually this morning, I've not heard us talk about the different colors of the different fuels, but we need to look at the whole life cycle of that fuel and where it's coming from. So, because not all zero emission fuels are created equal when we look at them from a well to wake perspective. I think it was mentioned earlier that when certain terminals have looked at traditional fuel trucks using biofuels versus where the electricity comes from. This is a similar idea that if you're using electricity from the grid to make e-fuels, you need to be sure you understand where it's coming from. So we end up with fuels that are grey, brown, blue, all these different terms. There's just varying differences in terms of their carbon intensity throughout the whole life cycle. And it's something worth being aware of, particularly as a port when you start to look at if you're going to be a bunker supplier, potentially where are your feedstocks going to come from in order to enable you to do that. The other hurdle is cost, the cost of fuel. The cost of fuel to the ship owner, but also are we able to get enough demand to drive the cost down in a particular location? As we've heard, the fuels are less energy dense, so there's a potential that we need more bunkering stops if we're not to take up cargo capacity on board vessels. We do think that we'll see the cost of those fuels start to come down as electrolyzer technology gets better and as there's more readily available electrolyzer facilities. But it's still going to be more expensive and you're going to need more of it to do the same shipping work than we do with traditional fuels. And I think then it serves that, it's all right having fuels and talking about the assets. But I think, again, it maybe was hinted at earlier, the biggest risk holder is probably the ports or the companies that decide to be future fuel bunkering suppliers as opposed to the organizations that build a dual fuel vessel. Because if I build a dual fuel vessel today, yes, I pay an additional capex when I build the vessel, but there's no obligation on me to continue to use a more expensive fuel. And if the market or regulation doesn't push me to do that, even though I have a dual fuel, ammonia, methanol, whatever fuel, I could still continue to use a traditional fuel provided my vessel remains compliant. What that means is that if you invest in a bunkering infrastructure for a future fuel, or if you invest heavily in shore power for your port, or if you invest in storage facilities and you don't, the regulation or the drive from the ship owners and operators isn't there to use the fuels, I would argue that you adopt a greater risk in that scenario than, say, the ship owner that can go back to the traditional fuels. And my penultimate slide, or my final slide before I say thank you and leave you to get to lunch, is also the human factor. There's a huge opportunity as we make changes and as operations become more sophisticated, as we make them more efficient with new fuels and new technologies. There's the opportunity to create jobs, both on board the vessel and shoreside. But I think we also then need to look at keeping people safe. So we've mentioned the risks around ammonia, but it's not just in the port, but it's also on board the vessel. And then also we need to look at the training that we offer to those people that are at the coalface of using those fuels, bunkering those fuels, or interacting with the vessels that are using those new fuels. And with that, I'll finish, but perhaps I think one thing we've heard a lot about the challenges that are in front of us. We've heard a lot about investment and things like that. And I think really in order for us to move forward, there's a whole bunch of stakeholders in different verticals or different silos that for us really to meaningfully move forward and to do it in a way that is beneficial to all parties is we need to see a greater share of information and probably more cooperation, as was mentioned by my earlier colleagues on the panel, that we would maybe not have normally seen within the shipping industry. And that could be across shipping companies, it could be across charters, or it also could be between ship owners, charterers, operators, and ports and terminals. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you after this session. Thank you.
Okay, Taylor, thank you very much. We're going to have about 7 or 8 minutes for Q&A. But Taylor, just to note and pick up on a couple things you said. Certainly, it's sobering to hear someone in your capacity who is knowledgeable about the IMO raised doubts about whether there will be a significantly robust carbon tax that will emerge from the MEPC dialogue, which is going to reveal itself in terms of the outcome next year, next April, I think. So if we do not have such a pricing mechanism that comes out of the IMO, I think that raises very profound questions for how this whole process is going to unfold going forward. And I think DATUC, what it does is put the focus back on what you were saying in terms of the need for ROI, actual profitability associated with investments, as opposed to leaning on, sort of a regulatory structure in order to create the necessary funding, which is, I think that there has been almost an assumption that the IMO will in fact do its job and will put teeth behind its own aspirations, but that is not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. So we go off into quite a bit of an uncertain environment. You saw that with the Maersk announcement a few months ago, when Maersk had been quite critical, disparaging even of LNG as a fuel source, because it's a carbon emitter, and it only reduces carbon output by whatever the number is, 20%, 25%. And yet the new fleet replenishment program of Maersk, a very significant investment, was LNG because of in part because of the regulatory uncertainty meaning that the cost of methanol, which had been its preferred alternative fuel, that there is no guarantee that they're going to be able to procure enough fuel to run its fleet at an acceptable cost while maintaining profitability. So enough from me. We have a few minutes for questions. Is there anybody? Alan, yes.
Hi, Alan Murphy from Sea Intelligence. First of all, I'd like to applaud DATUC for honestly a refreshing level of frankly level of honesty. It's really great to hear that at least there's some honesty. I also got to be admitting, the libertarian in me is screaming out in pain. All I've heard and all I hear anymore is the unrelenting hammer of government regulation is the only thing that'll fix this. 20 years ago, we thought there were market-based solutions. In the end, everybody in this room, their job is paid by the end consumer. We thought there was a future where you buy a t-shirt and right next to the price, there's your emissions onto it. We thought there would be a market-based solution. I also have lost faith in it. You mentioned yourself that it's about ROI at the end. Somebody has to pay for this. Have we lost the belief that there can be a market-based solution? I'll be honest, the space that we monitor, people who read our reports know that for the past 12 years, we've been hammering the ocean carriers. If you use the ocean carriers' online carbon calculators, you get nothing but lies and unicorn farts. It's completely useless. It's BS all the way through. So it's not even possible for the end consumer or shippers or anybody to have any reasonable estimate of the impact from the supply chains on emissions. So is there a possibility that we can find a market-based solution? Is it to get regulators to force proper standards, reporting methods, visibility, so that we can actually allow consumers to make a choice? Or is it just going to be regulation?
DATUC, that's for you.
Thank you. Nice to start with an easy question. So I actually do believe there is one market-based solution. But strangely, the market-based solution needs government intervention. So the one I actually like the most, and I think is very easy to apply in the EU, and that's why I'm very skeptical over the EU's plans and what they claim. And I think part of it, unfortunately, the EU is actually slightly greenwashing, because even if you look at the EU ETS and the CBAM, these are all things which don't affect people within the EU as much. It affects people outside the EU as much. So for me, this is another form of trade barrier, right, which they're trying to impose. Even the IMO rules, These are all trade barriers that the EU is trying to impose, claiming that this is for decarbonization. Now, if the EU was really, 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 really serious about climate change, they would change the VAT into a CAT, which is a carbon added tax, which means if your good uses more carbon, you should pay a higher tax for it. If your good does not create more carbon, then you pay a lower tax for it. In which case, your t-shirt, you don't even need to put next to it, this has how much emissions, because it'll be built into the price. Now, this is why I have huge skepticism with regards to the EU, and of course the US as well, whether they truly, really want to solve climate change, or whether they're just greenwashing because this helps their businesses and helps their communities, whilst the politicians don't have to face the taxpayers who have to actually pay for this. Yeah. Because the world's largest emitters globally is the EU and the United States, right? And if we really want to solve this, these are the two economies which have to start paying for it themselves by just putting a carbon tax on what they consume. Yeah. And if these consumers then have a choice, I mean, to be fair to all of us, if the carbon-free solution is cheaper, we go for it for sure. All of us in the room. We don't have to think. None of us will have to think. We all want it to be greener. The problem is the carbon-free solution is more expensive today, and therefore, as I said just now, 82% of us will say, I'm not going to pay for that. And to be fair, out of the 82%, I think 75% can't afford to pay for that. And I think that's really the issue. So I think, this is where, for me, are we really trying to solve climate change here? Right? So that's really the question I have. Because if we're really trying to solve climate change, then the consumer has to pay. And I think the problem now is that politicians globally, to be fair, every country included, are just too weak, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that any of them have the balls, basically, to do this. And that's why I think.
Andy, do you want to add to that? Thank you, Data.
Add
Excellent.
something that's a bit more positive, perhaps.
Whoa.
So, like in the power sector, electricity sector, we've seen the levelized cost of electricity come down significantly for green, right? 20 years ago, solar was expensive, but I'm on the execution front of DP World's decarb strategy. I actually negotiate these PPAs. Right now, the green PPAs are frankly cheaper than the incumbent utility, right? So we've seen progress in terms of green that I believe 20, 30 years ago, the regulations in place, basically you see the fruits of the labor 2 or 3 decades later, right? So I know specifically for a shipping sector, the regulations are upon us, but perhaps it's not till 2040, 2050, which we'll actually see some of the results. My 2 cents.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
But do you think we can force proper visibility and reporting standards? So because right now, say on the ocean side, it's all lies, and that's a big problem for me.
Yeah. So I mean, okay, I agree with you that some of the calculators out there are, as you say,
all of them,
rainbows and whatever, right?
Right.
But there are also other programs such as book and claim systems, which are a bit more concrete, right? So the book and claim systems is where actual vessel operators that do run e-methanol, for example, they spent the money and then they want to capitalize on some of the credits, right? And so through that book and claim system, they can actually sell those credits. And that's more, verified, right? Because of the fact that there's actually some sort of financial burden upon that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hate this. We're just getting warmed up, right? This is really a great discussion, but the problem is it's lunchtime and we're all hungry. Okay, one more question, Sebastian, and then we have to let these good people go have lunch.
I'm Sebastian from Freight.org, and I have a question, I think, to Andy, Datuk, and Taylor, because you've, Taylor, on your slides, you had as the ports are crucial for this decarbonization. And I really loved this center where you've had operations planning and the cooperation between different parties as a potential. And I wonder if you have any specific numbers that you have evaluated actually sitting in this space, plus, the comments from you guys from the ports as well. What's your view on that? So this is like kind of a one question for 3 people, is it not? Okay.
Yeah, but
So you're talking about the cooperation between ports and operations?
Yes, this operation planning potential.
So I think it plays into the earlier question as well. So I am a strong believer that we've got a lot of fat in the shipping system. We can do a lot ourselves to look at how we do it and reduce it. It might go against what we've done sometimes before, and it might mean that we've got to change some of the agreements that we have in place. But I think we can do it with some cooperation and data sharing and things like that. For numbers, I don't have one from the container terminal, but we recently did a project outside, in the container segment, but we've recently done a project outside the container segment where we worked with a charter, helped them look at how they used assets and where they had waiting time and things like that. We didn't eliminate it because I think you need some redundancy and stuff like that. But we were able to, in doing that, it didn't cost them a huge amount to do it. It just was a lot more cooperation and justifying within the organization and their partner organizations on why to do it. And in doing so, we were able to save them in fuel, and we were able to save them in demurrage, and it was north of $1 million GBP. So that was, it was an ability to save fuel, reduce carbon, and also then save money at the same time. So I think there are these mechanisms by doing something better in different places that you can look for ROI. It's not always going to be there. It is more expensive, but yeah, potentially there's some solutions there as well.
Great, thank you. How about a nice round of applause for this terrific panel? Thank you all. Appreciate your attention. I hope you all enjoy your lunch.